All right, so we're going to learn today how to play the game of chess. Now, I'm just going to simply go over the rules of the game. I'm not going to talk strategy. I'm not going to talk about like what's a good idea and what's not. I'm just simply going to talk about the rules, how pieces move, maybe how the board sets up, and all the other things, and rules regarding what the objectives are of the game. And that's kind of what I'm all going to be doing in this video. So no strategies or anything like that. This is just the raw, bare bones rules of the game. Okay. So the first thing in chess is that the objective of the game is to go and checkmate the opponent's king. Now, we're definitely going to get into what that means. Checkmate is simply when you decide you go after the enemy king with your army and you completely surround him and there's no way out. That is the goal of the game. Chess is going to be played on a checkered board, and so checkers is like I guess maybe a close cousin to chess if you ever played checkers before. But like in checkers, for example, the objective is just to capture all the pieces. In chess, although that certainly helps to capture all the pieces, that's not necessarily the goal of the game. So the goal is to go after the enemy king and checkmate him. And of course, making sure that you don't get checkmated either, because your opponent's trying to do the same thing to you. Some of the basic rules of the game: when it's a turn-based game, so you make a move, your opponent goes, you go, he goes, right? So you're just going to kind of keep taking turns in sequential order. When it's your turn, you can only move one piece at a time, so you can't be picking up multiple pieces at the same time and just doing whatever you want. It's only one piece at a time. Since it's turn-based, some turn-based games, for example, allow you to pass, but in chess, you cannot pass. There is none of this like, oh, it's my turn, but I don't feel like moving. Pass. You can't do that in chess. That's not a real thing. When it's your move, you must make a move. Some other basic rules is that whoever's playing with the white pieces, white always goes first. Now, I don't know how this game has not been canceled in our recent culture. However, that is just how the rule of the game goes. That's just kind of the basics of like very intro sort of stuff with chess. So now we're going to move on to how the pieces move. All right, so in chess, there are 6 chess pieces, and we're going to go through how each piece moves, because each piece has its own unique move set, and we're going to go through each one together. And so the first one that you see here on the screen is the bishop. I'll start with the bishop, because I think these first few pieces I'm going to talk about are a little bit easier to understand, and then we'll get more complex as we work our way up the ladder of the 6 chess pieces. So this is the bishop. The bishop is what we consider to be a long-range piece in chess. Out of all the 6 chess pieces, 3 of them are long-range, and the bishop is one of them. Okay, so the bishop moves in a diagonal sort of fashion. So the bishop can go to any one of the squares here. It can go in any of these directions. So any of these squares that I'm highlighting here, the bishop can move to. Okay, now this is an open board, so you can see that the bishop has a decent amount of control over a lot of different squares. Now, if this chessboard had other pieces on it, there'd be a different story. Each chessman has their own unique move sets, and this just happens to be the bishop. So some other tips with the bishop and some other rules is that, for example, like if you have another piece just sitting here, right? If there's a piece in the way, the bishop, for example, cannot go to any of these squares anymore. So in this point, this bishop could still move, to these directions, but because there's a piece in the way, he can't move past it anymore. Bishops cannot jump over other pieces, whether they're friendly or enemy pieces. So even if you were to throw in, for example, another piece here, this bishop, for example, cannot go to any of these squares that I'm highlighting because the bishop can't jump. So from here, the bishop can actually go here, and can go all the way in here. So any of these squares that I have highlighted here, the bishop can move to. Okay. Now notice, because this is an opponent's piece, this black bishop here, this opponent's piece, you can actually capture it. You would just simply pick up the bishop and just move it on top, just like that. And if you're playing over the board, then obviously you would just remove it off the board and put it on the side of the table or something. From this position, this board, for example, has more, there's more going on. And so this bishop can still, move diagonal, but because there's pieces in the way, there's more limited range. So this bishop can capture these 2 other pieces here, but he cannot go beyond. So like these squares that I have in orange, that I've highlighted in orange here, the bishop can't jump. Okay. Out of all the 6 chessmen, 5 of the pieces cannot jump over other pieces. There's only one that can, and we're going to talk about him later. All right, so this is the bishop. The rook is the exact opposite of a bishop. Rooks can only move horizontal and vertical, like this, or along the chessboard. So you see that it's the exact opposite of the bishop. So any of these squares that I'm highlighting in red here, this rook can move to. Okay. So this rook has, again, probably square count anyway, probably has very similar control as the bishop. And these are the movements that the rook can make. The rook can also be impeded by its movement by having another piece next to it. This rook still does its horizontal and vertical movement, but its range is now limited because there's other pieces in the way. So because there's a friendly piece right next to it, this rook can't actually move to any of these squares at all, and including on top of the bishop, because you can't capture your own pieces. And plus, even if you could, why would you? That's stupid. So the rook can definitely capture the enemy bishop. You know, these are all real legit moves that I'm highlighting here in red, and you can capture this bishop just like that. The rook is also a long range piece just like the bishop. So bishops and rooks are simply the opposite. Bishops move in an X shape and rooks move horizontal and vertical. Let's talk about the queen. The queen is the second most important piece in chess. However, she is the single most valuable piece. The reason for that is because the queen is actually a fusion between the rook and the bishop. So the rook and the bishop, if they did the fusion dance and they fuse together, you would get the queen. So the queen can go horizontal and vertical, just like the rook can, but she can also go diagonal as far as she wants as well, just like the bishop, to any of these squares. Any of these squares, okay? Any of these squares. And this is her potential range on this particular square for the next move. So she can move to any one of these squares on the current turn. So you can see that the queen exerts a lot of force over the board. Just like the bishop and the rook, the queen can't jump over other pieces, whether they're friendly or enemy pieces, doesn't really matter. So from here, for example, the queen can go to any of these squares. Okay. So you notice that her range this time is a little bit more limited because there's pieces in the way, because she can't jump. You can capture this enemy bishop, you can capture the enemy rook, but again, you can't go to the square beyond. You can't go beyond those squares because she cannot jump. And you also see that the queen, if she wants to go down here, this knight is in her way. Well, we're going to talk about him later, but there's just a friendly piece of the same color in the way. We're going to move on and talk about the king. The king is the single most important piece in the chess game. So the king can move one square in any direction to any of these squares. Okay, so you can see that he's not flying across the board like the queen can or like the rook can. Okay, the king doesn't actually have that much like warrior capability as much as the other pieces have that we've covered already. Now, because the king is the most important piece, there are a few not really special rules, I guess, but when if you were to have, for example, let's say there's an enemy rook here. So remember, we covered rooks. So this rook can move to any of these squares. So this king normally can move one square in any direction, but because of what's going on, he can actually go to only these squares here. Okay, so the king cannot move to any of these squares. Normally he could, but because there's an enemy rook here, or just an enemy piece, doesn't have to be a rook, but just some enemy piece that's covering these squares highlighted in red, it would actually be illegal for the king to move here. So just picking your king up and putting him here would actually be an illegal move. So if you're playing online, you'll actually see that if you try to pick up the king and put him here, when you let go of your mouse, it'll just the king will just let go and it'll snap back to the old square. This bishop is covering all of this, so the king can't actually move to these two squares like he normally would be able to, but he cannot. The king cannot actually move to these two squares because the bishop would eat him. So the king is the only piece in chess that cannot actually be captured like all other pieces can. So that's why there's a special rule with him where he cannot deliberately or even accidentally go into the line of fire of another piece. This king can only go to these squares because the bishop doesn't cover those squares. The bishop covers all of this. Okay. Talk about the knight. The knight is probably one of the more confusing pieces in chess. So I'm going to try to go slow on this one. The knight has a very funky move set. The knight moves in a weird L shape. So from here, if you use your mouse and draw an L, so it would be like this. Okay. So you see how this is sort of an L-shaped movement. So you would actually pick up your knight, 1, 2, and then over 1. Okay, so from this position, the knight goes 2 and then 1 over. Or you could go 2 and then 1 over. So both of these squares are valid squares for the knight. In fact, with the knight in the middle of the board like this, there's actually 8 valid squares. So it would be an L shape. So just imagine picking an L from a piece of paper and just shifting it and flipping it around. So then you would just go 2 and then 1 like this. So that's a valid square. 2 and then 1. Okay, so that's another valid square. 2 and then 1. Okay, valid square. 2 and 1. So you see how each time I'm making an L shape. So I'm going 2 squares in horizontal or vertical, and then I'm going 1 square perpendicular to the direction I just went. So 2 and then 1. So again, 2 and 1, valid square. 2 and 1. Okay, so it almost, from this sort of view, it almost looks like I guess the knight sort of have almost like octopus sort of reach. This knight can actually capture any one of these 8 pawns that you see on the board. Another special, not special, this is just how the knights move, but out of all the 6 chessmen, the knight is actually the only one that can jump over other pieces. If this knight, for example, wants to go to the square, because remember 2 and 1, he can just do it. These pieces are not really in his way. He just jumps right over them. So he would just end up here when you're done. Same thing's true if you were to put enemy pieces in the way. If you were to put an enemy piece here and let's say like over here or something, this knight can still go here because it's just 2 and 1. He just jumps over everything. As before, the knight still has all 8 of these valid squares that he can move to. It doesn't matter that there's pieces in the way, quote unquote, because he just jumps right over everything. Okay, he can just jump. The knight doesn't actually do anything with the pieces that he's jumping over. The jumping is just simply a means to an end. Now we're going to talk about the pawns. Pawns only move in one direction. So in this particular position, white is actually moving his army this way, and black is moving his army this way. Okay, so pawns will eventually sort of hit each other in the middle of the board here, and they'll be kind of up in each other's faces. Pawns are the only chess piece that cannot retreat. Pawns actually have sort of 3 different ways that they move. They do generally always move forward, but the way that they move forward is a little different depending on the circumstance. Just each color side only moves forward. The black pawns will come this way and march themselves this way, and the white pawns will march themselves this way. When a pawn moves, it can only move 1 square forward at a time. So if it was white's turn, this pawn right here can only move forward 1 square, and that's it. That's 1 turn. So pawns are very slow. This pawn's only legal move is right here. Then this pawn and this pawn can only move 1 square forward. So then you would move here or something, and that's it. That's the end of black's turn. Now, there is sort of one exception. When the pawn is moving forward, if the pawn has not moved yet at all for the whole game. So these pawns all here on white side haven't moved at all. This is their original starting position. If a pawn is still in its original start position, it has the option of moving forward too. So any one of those 5 pawns I just highlighted here, any one of those pawns can actually shoot forward 2 squares. So this pawn can actually just move forward 2 squares. But after the pawn has moved at least once, moving forward 2 is no longer an option. Now the pawn also has a 3rd way of moving as well. Pawns capture diagonally forward. So this is actually a valid move. The pawn can actually take diagonally forward. And so, but once he's taken diagonally forward, like if it was white's turn again, this pawn can only move forward. Okay. And if it's white's turn again, white can then move this pawn up 1, or it can take him. Okay, just like this. This pawn actually can't move at all because it can only move forward, but it cannot capture forward. It doesn't even matter if this was like another piece, like if we were to put a knight here. This pawn still can't move at all. So this pawn is just frozen in place. He just cannot move, no matter what. The only way this pawn were to ever be able to move is if this knight were to get out of the way, and then you can move it up. Or if we were to reset the position, if some other piece ends itself next to the pawn. So then now you can then just take it, right? And let's say black plays some dumb move or something. White can then just either take this pawn or he can move forward. So here or here are both valid options. All right, so now we're going to move on and talk about what check and checkmate are, okay? I need to kind of explain what check is first in order for checkmate to make a little bit more sense. So in the following position you see on the board, this is definitely very different from what we've seen before, but this is like a normal chess game in action. Okay. So it's black's turn. So if black were to make a move, black can actually pull out his bishop here and go on this square. Okay. So if this bishop is coming here, remember, bishops move diagonally. So with this movement, this bishop can actually just take the king on the next move. So this position is what is known as check. So the white king is now in check. Okay. When check is occurring on the board, whether it's white or black, doesn't matter. When one of the kings is in check, like the current position, there are a possibility of 3 options happening. Okay. Now, not all the following 3 options I'm about to talk about, not all 3 options are going to always be available to you. Sometimes only one of them might be available to you. Sometimes 2 of them might be available, or sometimes all 3. So in this position, all 3 options are actually available to you to get out of check. Okay. So the most simple way to get out of check, or to get the king out of danger for white, the simplest and most easiest way to understand is just to move the king. So in this position, this king can actually move here or here, okay? Because if you were to put the king here, this bishop is no longer attacking because the king is now safe. So he's gotten out of danger. The king can also move here as well. So the bishop is attacking this square, but the king's not on it anymore. So now the king is on a safe square, okay? So that's one way to get out of check. Another way to get out of check is to simply block. Now blocking really only works with more longer range pieces. So since there's squares in between the bishop and the king, you can block it, right? So in this position, there are actually a lot of different ways to block the check. And I'll just kind of go over them. So you can block the check by taking another piece of yours and just shielding the attack. So I can move my bishop out and block the check. So by putting this bishop here, what's happening is that because the bishops can't jump, this bishop is no longer threatening the king. Okay, because there's a white piece decided to put himself as like a human shield in front of the king. Okay, so this is a valid move. Another possible block is, again, 2 and 1. This knight can also move up here instead. So instead of putting him here, you can put him here from this old position down here. This is also a very valid block as well. And then finally, the third way that you can get out of check, if it's available, of course, is to simply take the piece that's attacking the king. So in this position, there's only one piece on white's army that can actually just remove this bishop off the board, and that's this pawn here. Because remember, when pawns capture, they capture diagonally forward. So this pawn can actually just take this bishop off the board and then just call it a day, just like that. Okay, so now the king's no longer in danger because the attacking piece is just gone. He died. He got captured. So in this position, White decided, you know what, I'm just going to win the game. And he put his rook here. So now this is a position that's called checkmate. And now checkmates look there's endless combinations of how, like, what checkmate might look like, but this is one of the most easiest ones to kind of understand. So checkmate is when the king is in check, but he cannot block the check, he cannot move out of the way, and he cannot take the attacking piece. If the king is in check, but he cannot defend himself in any of those 3 ways that we talked about, then the game is over and it's checkmate. In this position, there is no pieces that can block the check from the rook. Okay, so black doesn't have any other pieces. There's nothing anywhere else. So you can't block the check. The king can't move out of the way because the rook is covering the entire row, and this queen is also covering this entire row as well. So the king would normally be able to move to all of these squares, but he can't because the white queen and the white rook are both covering everything. So this is just a checkmate. We discussed what check and checkmate are. And checkmate is a winning condition for whoever is performing the checkmate. But not every chess game is a win or a loss for somebody. Checkmate is not always achieved. There are plenty of games that can result in a draw. And so we're going to talk about those draws. There are actually 6 ways to draw a chess game. If you don't use a clock, then there's only 5. But if you use a clock, then there are actually 6 ways to draw a game. One of the most common ways to draw is, and probably the easiest way, is someone just says, hey man, you want to draw? And the other guy's like, sure. Pretty straightforward. You can offer a draw in most chess games. You can offer a draw at any time. And if the person accepts, then bam, it's a draw. Easy enough, happens a lot. The next type of draw might maybe or maybe not be the easiest to understand right away, but it's actually one of the more common ways to draw a chess game, especially at the higher levels. So in this position here that you see, it's White's turn. White's got some problems because Black is looking to give a checkmate here, and there's actually no way to defend it. How do you survive? You're going to get checkmated next turn, and your king just can't move right now. And so the king is currently not in danger, but he's going to get checkmated next turn because the queen's going to come here. There is actually a resource to find a way to draw the game, because if you're losing this badly like this, if you can find a way to draw the game, that you would be very happy with that. So White actually does have a draw. From this position, White can actually just give a check. Bam, like this, okay? Black's king is in check this turn right now, so you have to get out of check. Whenever you're in check, you have to get out. And so the Black king is currently in check by this White queen. So Black only has one way to get out of this check, and that is to move. The only movement is right here. So Black then has to move here. But then White says, okay, not a big deal. I'm just going to check him again. So now the White queen is still attacking the king. But again, the king can just get out by moving back. But then the queen gives another check and you move here. So you see that there's this repetition happening here. So this draw, what would happen is that White's just going to keep giving checks endlessly forever. And so this would then just be declared a draw because White is just going to go back and forth, checking the Black king every time he moves out of the way. And so it's called a threefold repetition. And so whenever the position repeats itself 3 times, not necessarily in a row, but it's usually in a row. When the position is repeated 3 times, then it's just a draw, and that's it. So another type of draw is just called insufficient material. What that simply means is a fancy way of saying, hey, we've decimated each other's armies, and all that's left are the 2 kings. And if that's all that's left, then it's a draw, because neither player has enough material. Nobody has a big enough army to achieve a checkmate. Another type of draw, this one is going to be a little weird. This one's called a stalemate. It's different from checkmate in one key factor. White is winning the game, but they make a mistake. They put the queen here, okay? So in this position, it's Black to move. This king can't actually move anywhere. He can't go here, can't go to any of these squares at all, because the White queen has all these squares covered, and then the White king has this square covered. So all of these squares are all defended. However, the current square that the king is on is actually safe because no one's actually checking him right now. He's not in check. Because some of the basic rules, when we go back to earlier in the video, the basic rules of the game were that when it's your turn, you have to make a move. But what if every move puts you into danger, like puts the king in danger? If every move were to put the king in check, that's what's called a stalemate, and that's what this position is. This Black king can't actually move anywhere at all, but he's also not in danger. So it's not checkmate because he's not even in check. So why would this be a win for White if he threw this away by accident? So that's stalemate. Hopefully that was understandable. There's another rule in chess that's called another draw that's called the 50 move rule. Okay, so the 50 move rule states that if a pawn hasn't moved or if no captures have been made within 50 moves, it's just a draw on the spot. The reason this is the case is because I think the idea is that if people are shuffling their pieces around, and this mostly happens when there's no pawns left. If there are no pawns left in the game to move forward, and it's just regular pieces just shuffling around all the time, neither side should be able to get a win. Because if you can't win in 50 moves, then you should be able to win in 50 moves, especially if it's like an endgame like this, like the one that's currently open. So if White, for example, didn't know how to checkmate this here, which I'm assuming most of you are beginners watching this, so it's definitely possible you don't know how to do this yet, but we'll cover that in future videos, I suppose. But if White just continues to shuffle around like this and just doesn't know what they're doing, and like the White queen just flying all over the place and she just doesn't know how to win, then you keep moving like this for 50 moves and you just kind of go wild. Like it's just a draw. 50 move rule. The 6th draw is if you use a timer. Normally in chess, if you're playing with a chess timer, if somebody loses time, like if somebody hits 0 on their clock, they lose. Let's say White has 1 second left on the clock, and they're not able to move their hand or their mouse, depending on if they're playing online. They're not able to move their pieces fast enough to achieve a checkmate. Black doesn't actually have enough material to checkmate. This would actually be a draw. If this was a time game, of course, and there was a timers. Now, if there were no timers and you're playing casually with a friend, then this draw doesn't really apply. Now what we're going to talk about is we're going to talk about special rules in chess. Now, we talked about the basics. We talked about how the pieces move. We talked about check and checkmate and the rules regarding that. And we've also talked about the different types of draws when a game's tied. Okay, so the last sort of portion before I show you the very end are special rules. In chess, there are 3 special rules. And I'm going to go through easiest to hardest to understand. So those 3 are called pawn promotion, castling, and the last one is en passant. Okay, so we're going to cover all 3. When a pawn reaches the other side of the board, it gets a promotion. When you reach the other side of the board, the pawn will actually, you place the pawn down and you immediately replace the pawn with either a bishop, you can replace it with a knight, a rook, or a queen. All 4 of those pieces are all valid pieces to promote to. 99% of the time, you're going to promote it to a queen because she's the most powerful, so why wouldn't you? But again, I guess that's more strategy, so we'll cover that a little bit later. You'll notice that when I move this pawn up here, it'll give me the following options. I can choose which piece I want it to be, and I'm going to select the queen. So, castling is a special rule, and the reason for that is because earlier in the video, when I covered basic rules, I did mention that when it's your turn, you can only move 1 piece at a time. Castling is the only exception. Castling is what you do is you swap the king and the rook, and they basically swap places more or less. The reason for castling is mostly a defensive move. You're putting the king kind of in the corner, and you're kind of keeping him out of the action, and keeping him safe. So it's mostly a defensive move. So how castling would work is that in this position, it's white's turn, okay? And so white can actually perform castling. So what you do is you would pick up the king, and normally the king only moves 1 square in any direction, but this is castling, so this is an exception to that. The king would actually move over here 2 squares. So this is the king's starting position, and his end square is going to be here. So he's actually going to move over 2 squares, and then the rook, you then jump the rook over and put him on the other side. Rules regarding castling is that, let's say this was black's turn, and let's say it was black's turn. If black decided to go here and give a check against the king, when the king is in check, you cannot castle when the king is in check. So you would then have to, like earlier when we talked about check, you would have to then block it with something. And then if you put the bishop there to block the check, let's say the queen moves out of the way, then you can just then castle right away, and then you're good. Other little rules with castling is, I'm not going to set up the board, but like if these 2 squares were under attack by an enemy piece, you can't castle. Also with castling is it has to be the king's very first move of the game, and the rook that you're castling with also has to be the same. It has to be his first move too. This king can actually castle either direction. So the king is always going to move 2 squares in one direction, and then the rook is just going to go on the other side. So if you want to castle the other way, you move the king over 2 and then put the rook on the other side like this. Okay. So again, castling can really only happen when the squares between the king and the rook are empty. Right? White can castle in either direction, but black at this current moment cannot because there's pieces in the way. The space between the king and the rook has to be empty. This last special rule is called en passant, and I know it's going to be probably the weirdest thing you've ever seen. This is the strangest move in chess because it kind of breaks everything. But that's why it's a special rule. That's why it's in this category. So it's black's turn in this position, and black decides, you know what? I'm going to move this pawn up 2 squares, and I'm going to put them right here. So the idea with why maybe black wanted to do this is because by moving the pawn from the starting position up 2 squares, remember, since pawns can only capture diagonally forward, the black is thinking, okay, if I push the pawn forward 2, then I'm passing which is what en passant means. I'm passing by the other pawn. This white pawn can actually take the black pawn still. So what you would do is then with en passant, you would actually capture, quote unquote, the pawn by moving behind it like this and then just removing it off the board. So the idea with this is that it's simulating as if this pawn only moved up one square instead. That's really what it's simulating. So if black decides to move it forward 2 squares, white would then take it like this, and then that'd be the end. Is that it has to happen immediately on the next move. So if black decides to shoot forward 2 like this, and let's say white plays something else, and then black plays something else, because you've wasted a turn, you can't do en passant anymore. The computer wouldn't let you do it. And so it's not a legit rule anymore. So now this pawn cannot capture en passant this way anymore. Finally, we're going to talk about how the board is normally set up in chess. So normally you have an empty board like this. You'll notice that on the computer version anyway, you'll have little letters and numbers on the sides and on the bottom. So the computer obviously already sets the board up perfectly. But if you're playing over the board, if you have that 8x8 checkerboard, you're going to want a lighter square in the lower right. So the lower right-hand corner, you're going to want it to be a light square right here. The rooks are going to go in the corners. This. Then next to the rook is you're going to put the knight down next to them. That. Then followed by the bishops. Put the bishops next to the knights. Which you're going to put the queen down. The queen will always go on the color square that she is. So the white queen goes on the white square, and the dark queen goes on the darker square, just like this. And then the king just gets put on the remaining square. So you'll notice that the kings are always facing each other and that the queens are always facing each other. And this should be pretty easy once you realize that the queen goes on her color. So the way to kind of remember that is that the dress matches the shoes. And finally, once all these main pieces are put down, then you're going to place pawns in front of them all like this. Okay. Now you can play.